Welcome to Politically Connected, a podcast on everything politics and governance in Kenya and Africa. We unpack the complexities between people, policy, and power. I'm your host, Diana Ngao,
aka Madam Speaker, and I am Chaka,
aka the Bishop. In this episode, we are discussing the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2 in the House of Senate. It's a bill that was sponsored by the very famous Senator Samson Cherargei. Famous because he, just when the Kenya Kwanza regime came into power, is when a lot of people got to know or see him being more vocal for saying that we should extend the presidential term limits. And now we have here the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2 of 2024 that was tabled in Senate on the 30th of August and is currently at the stage of public participation, by the way. So we've taken some time to go through this amendment bill, and to be honest, I was a little bit shocked. But before I get to what shocked me, hand it over to Chaka. Give us some key highlights of when you read. Did anything shock you? Did anything like I expected this year?
I think what shocked me is the audacity.
The audacity.
The audacity. You've talked about this ship called Kenya, sailing on the high seas and being hit by different winds and currents. This is a tidal wave. This bill,
This constitutional amendment bill.
It's a tidal wave, and the nature of tidal waves is that depending on how the ship is navigated, a tidal wave can capsize a ship. That's
true. Let me ask you, Chaka. It seems that ever since our first independent constitution, every presidential regime seems to want to amend the constitution. Remember in one of our episodes, which you guys should watch, on when we were celebrating the 14 years of the 2010 constitution, we went through some of the many constitutional amendments that went under President Moi, during President Moi's time. And then we had Kibaki's time, but Kibaki's time was something that was carrying forward something that had started during Moi's time of changing the constitution. And we got the brilliant 2010 constitution. Then we have Uhuru's time, and in Uhuru's time, maybe there was not clamor in the first term to change the constitution, but in the second term is where now BBI came in, which was some proposals that needed us to go to a referendum, or so we thought. And then now we have William Ruto regime, 2 years into ruling, and we have a constitutional amendment bill. What is it about? Is it me who's connecting the wrong dots? But why is it that every single president or their regime, let me not say it's a president now, their regime, it gets to a point that, okay guys, maybe we need to change this? Is it that our constitutional haifiki, like there are too many loopholes that it is like, it needs to always be course correcting as we move forward? Or is it now also being used as a political tool?
I wouldn't say that we're not connecting, or we're connecting dots that are not supposed to be connected. The thing about power is that, and I think this was stated by Abraham Lincoln, is that it reveals the character of the people who are wielding power. And so looking at all the presidents we've had, including the current one, I think the relationship with our constitution, and specifically constitutional amendments, reveals their
His character.
characters, and maybe also their response to the political context that was dictating the times. The late Mzee Jomo Kenyatta comes into power under what was essentially a negotiated settlement between KANU and KADU, that had very different ideologies in terms of how the country should be run. So KANU had ostensibly agreed to certain to include certain issues that were important to KADU, so that they could form a government going into power as the country got independence. And that had to do with issues to do with federalism, Majimboism,
regional,
which was devolution in a different form, had slightly different characteristics. And even at that time, there was bicameral parliament. The first bicameral parliament was post-independence. We had a Senate. So that new government comes into power and slowly starts clawing back power to the center. So, and that is continued by the Moi regime, taking back power to the center.
And more amendments.
Yeah, you're seeing Kenya moving into a one-party state. There is less autonomy in the regions. Basically less devolution. There is less oversight by different organs, and so under the Moi regime we see a whole host of amendments, very many. The difference is now, as Kibaki comes into power, the nature of the amendments are not about consolidating and centralizing power to himself. We have introduced during the Kibaki time this concept of transformative constitutionalism. And the whole idea behind transformative constitutionalism is the constitution as a vehicle for change and transformation. And that's why you see the nature of the amendments under the Kibaki regime, despite an initial failed referendum, is that it was very participatory. And people were now really actively deciding on this social contract. And you see, the thing about a contract by its nature, it's an agreement
of parties.
And so Kenyans are coming together to agree. And in contract law, we say that you can't have an agreement if you don't have a meeting of the minds. So through that process of public participation, which now comes up later in our courts when BBI is being assessed in the courts, about how involved was the public in this process compared to before. So you can see that the Kenyatta one and the Moi regimes was really unilateral exercise of power. Kenyans weren't even really involved in the writing of that constitution. And amendments would just be tabled in parliament and passed, and people just hearing about it in the radio. So under the Kibaki regime, you see this very participatory process, which then gives birth to the 2010 constitution and several key provisions to ensure that governance, essentially, not even lawmaking or changing constitution, the process of government is an inclusive process. It's about involving the people. Devolution really is about taking government closer to the people.
Closer to the people.
So when you see then Kenyatta 2 and Right Honorable Raila coming together with BBI, again, if we honestly look at the nature of the amendments, whatever the failures of the process, you can see that those amendments were enhancing issues that had arisen from
the implementation of 2010
Exactly.
constitution, because Uhuru's regime was the first
exactly
government under the 2010 constitution.
Exactly.
They were the implementers.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so obviously, as you're implementing,
You start to see
sometimes
some
exactly
loopholes here and there.
things that can be improved.
Yeah.
And so, if we really conduct an honest assessment of BBI, it did have a lot of excellent proposals, some debatable.
Yeah.
But you can see, speaking to the character of those proposals and what they were seeking to achieve, for instance, you can see that for instance, in terms of gender parity, you are going to have 50-50 gender parity in Senate. Right? Yes. You are going to have each county having one male senator, one female senator. There were very many proposals. Yeah.
As you're speaking, I didn't want to make it about BBI, but as you're speaking, I remembered why I was, when you're speaking about BBI right now, I was trying to remember why was I opposed to BBI? And then when you mentioned now this, it sounds it's great. Like, I mean, Parliament has never been able to achieve the 2/3 gender principle, and having now getting gender parity at 50-50 at the Senate, it's great. But then I remember the argument was, this brings now a heavier burden to the people through their taxes to make payments to now a second senator. So I get, like, I remember, I feel like the timing for BBI was just wrong. But otherwise, some of the suggestions of BBI, which were great, as you said, and some of them debatable, if the timing was not at the time it was being proposed, perhaps the fate of BBI wouldn't be what it is today. And to be honest, after going through this bill, do you think you see some BBI in it?
Well, to timing, I would say that there is no wrong time to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And whereas, on the other hand, there is absolutely the wrong time to focus on things that are not priority issues.
Yeah.
And speaking to the keeping to the theme of our assessment of those other constitutional changes and amendments, what do these amendments reveal about the character of the current regime? Let me say the regime.
I see where you're going. Nakuona. Endelea. I'm happy being guided.
I think it reveals a lot that is wrong. A lot that is wrong.
Is it baby? Is it
I meant rotting.
A pun intended? Oh, the tongue is heavy. The tongue is heavy.
And where does one even begin? Now, this bill has been discussed in media.
Yeah.
It hasn't got much traction because of the many other things that are happening, including impeachment, including we're still recovering from the Reject the Finance bill and how it changed our political landscape. We're still dealing with Adani.
The rollout of SHA or SHIF.
Yeah,
there's a lot.
Still abductions. So there's a lot happening. So this is flying quietly under the radar. Let me give an analogy. I don't know if it's an appropriate one. Recently in international news, we've seen Israel being hit with a barrage of missiles. And previously, one of the things that was famed about Israel and its defense system was that it had this dome or shield
that
could detect, missiles coming in. But that dome has been penetrated. Why? Because the missiles which are now hitting are flying under the the range of detection of that dome. That dome detects missiles
from a certain
height and altitude. So these other missiles are flying under that level of detection, and this is that, it's flying under that level of detection.
You know, there are a lot of people also, in terms, if you're saying in the analogy of Israel and what's happening there, that in history their intelligence service has been said to be one of the best in the world, right? And even countries go and benchmark with their intelligence service.
The Mossad,
Yeah, the Mossad. And for such a caliber of attack to happen in their country, there are people, analysts, not me, I was listening to one. The analysts were saying that just the same way the Hamas allegedly caught Israel off guard in last year, October, even this hits is basically just Israel needed like
background of acceptance.
Exactly, that these guys, you saw all that, you know, it was like raining missiles, so we have to retaliate, and their level of retaliation. So for me, in that analogy, that as this thing is flying under the radar, that is why we have so many things. That's why they are allowing so many things.
And I think the analogy here actually is very apt, because what, though we're not saying it's the same thing, given the sensitivities of those
what's
conflicts,
happening in that side of the world.
But drawing from that analogy, I think we're saying that
two things could be true.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. In law, we have this term prima facie, which refers to things as they appear on the face of it. And I think what we are saying with this analogy is that there are the things as they appear, and there are things behind a veil of apparentness. And it means that there could be a lot of political games afoot that the public, most of us, may not be privy to, and it's only really an analysis such as ours that can attempt to uncover some of those games. Because indeed, reading this proposed amendments did leave me with very many questions. But maybe we can just go into some of the amendments for the sake of our audience. You know,
when I was reading this, or what caused me to read this is now some of the reports on media. And of course, the one that is the most aggravating, or the one that roused my emotions, is the extension of term limits from 5 to 7 years. So when I got this printed out, and I'm like, wanajaribu kufanya nini? And you know, and it's actually on one of the first few pages where you see that they are trying to change. But the more you read it, the more I was like, alas.
If you had asked me about this amendment bill a few days ago, actually that's what I would have told you about from what had been reported in media.
It seems
the extension
to be just
of term limits for the president, governors, MPs, MCAs, from 5 years to
7
years, and maybe the introduction of office of the prime minister. And I thought that was pretty much the most of it. But on reading it, the extension of term limits don't even bother me as much.
It's actually one of the, I feel like it's taking me back to the finance bill, where what media was reporting is that, you know, bread will be taxed, and, you know, it's roused emotions like, how can they even tax bread? But kumbe, now when more analysts were coming to analyze the bill, and they realize, there's also something here when it comes to importation of cars. There's something here. They started to uncover that there's so much more. Watch even that bread tax. And what happened is that the crowd, not the crowd, but people were so aggravated about the bread tax that when it went to parliament, wakasema, you know what, tumedrop. Tumedrop, you know. And I'm really hoping that is not the tactic here.
The tactic being that the extension of term limits from 5 to 7 years is a hoodwink, whereby when people make noise about it, it's reduced back to 5, and then it's now considered an acceptable amendment
exactly
bill.
That we've listened to you, you know, especially now in this period of public participation, you know, we've listened to you guys, you've said no, we've removed it. Hey,
so what are some of the other things that I hear that may pass undetected? I'll take the bull by the horns. And okay, first of all, it seeks to expand. You know, you were saying earlier that really this seems to be mostly be a bill about expanding the powers of Senate.
It really is a bill about expanding the powers of Senate, because in most of the clauses that they want to amend, they are saying remove National Assembly and replace with respective houses, meaning inclusion of the Senate into some of the
roles that were being done by the National Assembly, like vetting of CSs, judges, and the like.
And interestingly enough, they want to let me not say reduce. So when it comes to the vetting, mostly we know it's a National Assembly that vets the cabinet secretaries, the Chief Justice, the Attorney General, and even consulars like the ambassador and high commissioners. But now for here, in this proposal, what they want to do, I'm trying to look for it here, is that they want the Senate to vet the cabinet secretaries and all these other key appointments made by the president, and leave just the ambassadors and high commissioners and the diplomatic liaisons to the National Assembly.
Yes, and it does give a lot more powers to the Senate also in terms of, there's something very interesting happening here. So they propose to increase county revenue allocation from 15 to 40%, which is good.
But the current constitution says that it's a max to 35%, meaning even without the cap of 40, the current regime can actually disperse up till 35%.
So, not necessarily. Actually, it's the minimum that's being set, right? And so 40% actually means that more is being devolved to the counties, which is a good thing. However, inapatiana mkono mmoja na inachukua na hiyo ingine. Why? Because it's allocating 40% to counties, but those budgets now have to be approved by the Senate.
Yeah.
So you're really saying you're allocating more funds to counties, but taking away the power of the people to decide how those funds will be utilized, which is the whole essence of devolution. And we say the people because much as it's the county governments, remember that even budget making is a participatory process.
Yes.
And now
there has to be public participation in the county level for county budgets.
So now if you're taking this power to the Senate, it has an implication on devolution, which is a pillar of our constitution. It's one of the things we are most proud of in our constitution. Another thing it seeks to do, very interestingly, is that it proposes to introduce office of Prime Minister. Now, both increase in county revenue allocation, that was also in BBI, but the power to determine the budgets and hold counties accountable wasn't at the Senate in BBI. BBI also proposed the introduction of a prime minister who would be
the head of government
business and the leader of the biggest party in the National Assembly. Now, this amendment also introduces the office of the Prime Minister. It does also say that it will be the leader of the biggest party in Parliament.
I want to read it verbatim.
Yes.
There shall be a Prime Minister in Kenya who shall be a member of Parliament appointed by the President from the party or coalition of majority of parties in Parliament. The Prime Minister shall be the head of government responsible for day-to-day administration of government and shall be accountable to Parliament.
Yes.
Number 3, the Prime Minister shall serve at the pleasure of the President, and the President shall may terminate the appointment of the Prime Minister. So what I'm getting, I don't know, before I cut you off, is that the Prime Minister has to be a member of Parliament.
Yes.
So is it a member of the National Assembly or a member of Senate, or either?
So what happens is another amendment that's proposed by this bill is that it changes the order of precedence under Article 108.
Yeah.
Whereas the Constitution recognizes the order of precedence in the National Assembly in terms of leader of majority and the leader of minority,
Yes.
it now expands that order of precedence to also touch on the Senate. Essentially establishing new constitutional offices. What that means essentially is that if you now have a constitutionally recognized leader of majority in the Senate, it means that your Prime Minister can essentially be picked from Senate.
Hey. You know, before we started this this episode, I remember complaining to our 2 audience there, Nyambura and West, saying that why are they making these bills so complicated that it takes, if it was not for the legal mind here, that is Chaka, who helps sometimes contextualize some things, because as I read, but they're funny enough, when I read it, look what I've written here.
BBI 2.0.
Yeah, but I mean, it is hard for the common mwananchi to, so I wonder how, when you say, when they send it to public participation like this, me, I read it nachanganyikiwa. What do they mean by this? How can public participation be meaningful if me, myself, and how you frame all this, how it doesn't make sense to me? Or rather, it is so complex that I'm like, give me an abridged version of what you're saying, because to me, or rather, not just, I'm saying not just to me, but I'm just like to majority of Kenyans, it just seems to be locking out a good portion of people to participate in understanding what exactly these people want to do. So how can public participation be more meaningful?
You know,
it's by design.
you've used the phrase public participation a number of times, and I'll be honest, it does induce some anxiety because let me give a fictional story, or give a plot line for a movie.
Okay.
And I give a plot line for a movie because there's a world in which maybe this is just fiction.
Yeah.
Whereby, through this exercise of, there's a country in which vice president is being impeached through a vote of no confidence in the National Assembly of that country. Now, through this exercise, that country is known for its people being very litigious and going to court. Every time there's an issue, watu wanakimbia kotini.
Yeah.
And so, and this country had a recent history where certain amendments were proposed to their social contract, and it was stopped
At the courts.
by the courts, by the judges, even though all the county assemblies of that country, all but one, were for these changes, even though a majority of the National Assembly and their House of Lords were for these proposals. A small bench of
A
few judges said, nope, ampiti hapa. Now, from that experience, a new regime that came into power, learning from that experience, knew to anticipate some of these things, and so thought of, how do we have a discussion about certain issues that would, if we were to make certain changes, these issues would come up as things that could potentially stop these changes from going through.
Yeah.
Issues such as public participation. Now, maybe what we could do is start a process here for the removal of a vice president where certain key issues would come up. Issues such as public participation. Why? In the previous regime, those amendments were stopped because that there was insufficient public participation given the history of constitution making and the like.
Yeah, and it was not
as inclusive.
Yeah.
A process as it should have been. So let's start this process where we tackle this animal called public participation, and a determination is then made by the courts on how this public participation should look like. So that now when we bring these changes and the issue of public participation comes up, which we will have done based on this recent experience, if the court says public participation, we will say, but you told us that this is the threshold from this issue. So we have met it. Let us proceed. And it just so happens that in this country, in the House of Lords,
let's just call this country what?
in the House of Lords, because the National Assembly had voted overwhelmingly,
unanimously, almost,
not even overwhelmingly, overwhelmingly, to remove this vice president. Now, and people, there was so much consternation around the country and people wondering, and maybe part of the plan was that when it gets to the House of Lords,
it looks
like the House of Lords has come to sober institution, which has come to save the day. So that when you then bring about an amendment bill,
we want to give more power to the sober house.
It's just a story I'm telling.
What an interesting story.
It's possibly all fiction, maybe,
I'd buy that
but sometimes, what do they say? Life imitates art. Yeah.
I feel like tushamaliza analysis ya bill with that story, right?
Yeah, it could be a far-fetched analysis, but I think the moral of this story is that there are very many things at play. And things are not just what are the term I used earlier, how they appear prima facie, how they appear on the face of it. Because, and I'll give another example why I'm saying there are many things at play. Another thing that is proposed in this amendment bill, which was actually more shocking than the extension of term limits from 5 years to 7 years, was the amendment to emergency powers.
State of the emergency.
Yes.
That state of emergency cannot just be cannot be initiated by the National Assembly alone, but also the Senate.
And that would be okay.
Yeah.
Only the nature of that approval is also changing. And when we talk about state of emergency, for me, I associate state of emergency with Mau Mau uprising.
I know.
And the state of emergency taking place, Operation, was it Jockstock? And these emergency powers are being revised such that you could have a state of emergency in perpetuity, an endless state of emergency.
And also they talk about the deployment of KDF forces.
Before I lose that point, ideally, a state of emergency should just be 14 days.
Yeah.
These amendments expand extend how long those powers can be instituted for, and also provides for their renewal, but does not put a cap on their renewal.
Let me read what is the reason for this, based on this. The bill proposes the amendment of Article 58 of the Constitution to provide the involvement of the Senate and the National Assembly as a House of Parliament in the approval of the extension of a state of emergency. A state of emergency affects the stability of a functioning of the national and county governments and a nation as a whole. Consequently, it is important for both houses to be involved. I think what you are saying based on this is that the key word here is not just the approval, but the extension of the state of emergency.
Yes. Because if you look, what you've read from is the memorandum of objects and reasons. But if you look at the words that are being changed, that's where the real, to use legal parlance, mischief is occurring.
Yeah, actually, it's a first act. It's the first thing here. This by deleting the words National Assembly appearing immediately after the words declaration, and substituting it to the word Parliament. Wow.
And then thereafter,
Parliament may extend a declaration of the state of emergency by a resolution adopted following a public debate in Parliament and by majorities specified in Clause 4, but no longer for 2 months at a time, by deleting Clause 4 and substituting thereof for a new clause. Wait, what is Clause 4?
You'd have to look at the Constitution itself.
Yeah, but it's saying here. This is Clause 4 that supporting vote of at least 2/3 of all members of the National Assembly and 2/3 of the county delegations in the Senate. Wow.
Basically, if you have sufficient numbers in National Assembly and Senate, you can aggregate to yourself expanded powers in the executive.
And maybe to make people properly understand what a state emergency looks, because many of us were not alive when there was a state of emergency. So when a state of emergency is declared and the military now is on the streets, what exactly does that look like? Because it doesn't look like a Kenya that we know of.
You'd be surprised. Yes, many of us were not, most of us were not alive during the Mau Mau uprising, but we were alive during COVID.
Oh, yes. So we can, COVID.
And what happened during COVID, it was
lockdowns,
curfews. Curfews are a main staple of emergency powers. And essentially what happens with emergency powers is that it gives the executive power to curtail the Bill of Rights. That means freedom of movement,
freedom of expression,
freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, of the media, what can be aired, what can't be aired. Yes, it essentially, basically, you suspend a significant portion of the Bill of Rights, save for the right to life and such non-derogable rights.
That is very shocking. That is very shocking. And I'm even drinking water because I am. When I read it, I didn't pay much mind to it, because now when I read it, I read this bill all the way until the end, and that's when I came to say, I'm like, actually this is Senate wanting more powers. But now when you contextualize it like that in terms of the state of emergency, and you realize by the 7-year term limit is controversial, yes, but really not the main thing, because if they were to remove the 7-year term, sawa, but then we are left with all this.
And I'll tell you another story.
Hey, Chaka stories. Are we ready?
You see, let me paint for you a picture. There's a country in
we'll
which...
call the country Wakanda.
No, Wakanda is a beautiful place. At least, anyway, there's a country where certain constitutional amendments are being proposed. And in this country, the amendments that are being proposed are essentially designed to give more power to the House of Lords, right? And functions that would otherwise have been
delegated,
yes, to, or done by the National Assembly, will now be done by the House of Lords. That includes the appointment of CSs, things to do with budget making, including of the counties, things to do with states of emergency, declaring them and otherwise. Now, it just so happens, I just needed to give that summary because we're not talking about Kenya, we're talking about a fictional country. They are similar, but we're talking about a fictional country. Now, it just so happens that in that country, there was also something that was amiss with the Electoral Commission of Wakanda. You say the country is Wakanda. And that Electoral Commission of Wakanda did not have enough overseers, or what you call commissioners, and also the secretariat of that Electoral Commission was not properly functioning, which meant that even if you were to go to, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to go to an election. Now, in that same country, it just so happened that in their courts, before the highest court in the land, there was a major decision that was about to be made that would essentially lead to the dissolution of Parliament. But let me stop there. Sorry, did I say Parliament? I meant, yes, Parliament. But arguably, you see that the reason for dissolution had to do with in that country's constitution had a requirement for a 2/3 gender rule, which was supposed to have been implemented by a certain time. It wasn't, and that's why this whole issue is before the court. And some years back, a Lord Chief Justice of the court of that country had advised the king to dissolve Parliament because it was not. But it went back to the courts again, and now it's come all the way back to the Supreme Court.
This country is dealing with something. This fictional country is dealing with something that was historic, in their history.
But now,
and now coming back,
arguably, because what happened was that was an advisory. But now it was challenged in court, which meant you had to go through the normal court processes, it coming back to the Supreme Court. The question is, this dissolution, does it have to dissolve the entire Parliament or just the National Assembly? So if you have a more powerful House of Lords and all the key necessary functions being taken to this House of Lords, and you dissolve the National Assembly,
House of
Let's wait for part 2 of the book. Alama za Dukuduku to be continued.
You
Coming to a bookstore near you.
I think what is coming out, and this is something, but Chaka really paints the picture even very well, but this is something that I have been feeling or thinking in terms of the number of things that we, the people, are getting to know about in this period. We had the Adani deal that was uncovered, and it was a crisis for, I could say it was a crisis for national government. And then we have do I want to call it failed, but the rollout of SHA that was quite controversial and chief. And then we have the overwhelming impeachment of the deputy president. And then now we have this. This started cooking just when the president, remember you said in our last episode that when we were reading the impeachment process of the deputy president, it seemed like something that was cooked immediately they joined, the regime came into power. And the person who sponsored this bill had started these pronouncements just as they got into power that, you know what, a president needs more time to make changes, so we should extend it to from 5 years to 7 years. And true to it, I mean, he actually tabled it in parliament because he's a sponsor of this bill. But when after I've seen your perfectly painted picture of this fictional country, I start to see how sometimes fiction, like real life, can be borrowed from fiction and vice versa. And I'm now more and more convinced that there are a lot of things that are meant to take our attention, or majority of the people's attention, so that some other things can fly by. Because for me, in PR and communications, we always say, never waste a
crisis.
Never waste a crisis. And Kenya has been in crisis. And we are seeing the fruits of never missing a crisis.
I want to tell another story. But this story is going to start with a little legal education. Company Law 101. Now,
unaenda kwa shareholders.
Naenda kwa shareholders.
Unaguza mulima.
Naenda kwa shareholders. You know, in company law, we have the principle of a separate corporate personality, which means a company is a legal person which is separate from its shareholders,
the individuals,
who own it. Now, what usually happens is it was discovered over time that some of the people who would, in the company records, appear as the shareholders and the directors were really a front.
Proxies.
Yes, proxies. And so there is what was known as lifting the corporate veil. First of all, there are two layers. There's lifting the corporate veil to know who are the shareholders of this company, right? So now you're not just facing the company, but you're dealing with the owners of this company. But beyond that, you also now go to another layer, if those shareholders are proxies, to know the beneficial owners.
Yeah, and that was what, yeah.
So now, how is that relevant to this discussion? One of the things that has been disturbing me about how things have been going on in Parliament is that we need to start lifting the corporate veil
of who are the owners of some of these bills.
Yes, because
the sponsor is really not the owner.
Yes, the sponsor is sometimes a proxy for something that may have been written by a committee. And I'm not just talking about this bill, for instance. That includes, for instance, that impeachment motion, with much due respect to the legislator, Mwengi Mutuse, who I'm sure did excellent research in putting that motion together. But to have all that information, including what was owned by the sons, and that's
yeah,
a
yeah,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
detail to uncover by oneself.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying he didn't. I'm just saying that it's not easy to do so. Which points to the fact that it most likely was written by a committee. We have a number of bills in the National Assembly, in Parliament, that beg the question as to who the true owners are and whether they are even Kenyan.
Exactly. I remember we've had a conversation with one of the senior lawyers in this country, and he questions if some of the bills, down to even in the 90s, whether some of the bills and even the acts that we have passed in Parliament.
Hopefully we can invite him here.
Yeah, we don't want to let the cat out of the bag on who.
Yes.
You will see him here that day. But and he questioned, he continues to question since back then, that some of the laws that we have put together are laws who are sponsored by Kenyans or like members of parliament, but really the owners, they are not drafted here. And I remember during the uproar of the nuts and oils, is it the nuts bill that is it's a Senate bill sponsored by Senator Hamida. And when that bill was tabled at the Senate and there was a call for public participation, you know, Kenyans also are very, especially Kenyans on X, they're like detectives. They went quickly to Senator Hamida's profile, looked through, and guess what? They found a picture of her at IMF. Before. So there was uproar and saying, or people just saying that, you know what, she's been used as a proxy, and this is just how they are trying to ruin our country or control. You know, if you control someone's food basket and you control their money, then you basically control everything. So yeah, it's important we start questioning where exactly, who owns, start with saying who owns Kenya, but who owns some of these bills that have been proposed in Parliament. It also makes you start to think of the foreign influence and how long has it been there. You know, it starts to ask you that, and it's a question I've been asking, not only for Kenya, but the whole of Africa. Are we truly independent? Or are we just independent in the words that we have heads of states? You know, and we have this very nice democratic elections that happen. And I'm
Seemingly.
saying, yeah, seemingly democratic elections that happen across Africa, you know, and we have an Africa Union. We look very independent. But when we really look at the fine print of it all, you start to see the footprints of foreign powers in certain places. And I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying the sponsor of this bill may be a proxy to a foreign power. Absolutely not. That's not what I am saying. I'm going beyond this and saying that the more we look into some of the critical issues that we face, not only here in Kenya, but in other African countries, we start to see the footprint of foreign powers. And of course, when a foreigner is coming to tell you how to do business, it is not for your sake. It is for their sake. It is it's extractive. It is like, how can we make you make this law so that it allows my company to come and mine this oil here at a less tax rate? And I guess that's what, again, why we started this podcast anyway, is to question this.
And in terms of foreign influence and foreign presence, I think one of the ways I would ask that question is, or rather, I would wonder, did they ever really leave?
They never left. They just found a new way.
Yeah, and that's, we discussed in a previous episode about...
neocolonialism.
Exactly. Because there's also another agriculture bill that was proposed by nominated Senator
Sabina Chega.
And it's what you were saying about our food basket being controlled. And it's actually worrisome, because when you have freedoms being curtailed in terms of people being able to plant food.
And Kenya has such like a nini of arable land. Like people are planting things in the backyard.
And when you also consider things like even seeds, yes. Now with the introduction of GMOs, because of the genetic modification and that whole process, you can actually have intellectual property rights on certain seeds, such that it becomes illegal
for you
kupanda mbegu because you don't have the IP.
Absolutely terrible.
And some of those seeds, once they're planted, also can affect the nature of our soil. That can only allow certain seeds to grow.
I actually think we should have an episode about agriculture. We really do need to have an nini, because food security and food, let me say, independence. Like we need to be able to control our food basket, not just only as Kenya, but as Africa. We are such a land that is blessed with, so we are rich in minerals and rich with arable land, and when you go out of the country and you taste.
Some foreigners seem to agree.
Yeah, I know, of course. They see mama, they know. When you taste the watermelons grown somewhere else outside Africa, and then you come and taste the watermelons here, and you're like, man, kwani mumeongeza sukari? Like there's just a difference, and I feel like that's how blessed we are as Africa, and how can we be a continent that is so blessed with natural resource, with people, the talent that you see in Africa, with community, because Africa is known for being so communal in how we live with each other, but still be one of the poorest. Mimi sielewangi hiyo.
You've made me remember a song which I really love, which I think actually speaks to the mission of Politically Connected to raise the civic consciousness of the continent. Yeah. That song is by Damien Junior Gong Mali.
I thought you'd say Fela Kuti.
And in that song, he sings, Africa must wake up, the sleeping sons of Jacob. Yesterday we were kings. Can you tell the young ones, who are we today? Africa must wake up, the sleeping sons of Jacob. Wow. Yesterday we were kings. Can you tell the young ones, who are we today? Africa must wake up, the sleeping sons of Jacob, for what tomorrow may bring. May a better day come.
Wow. I have a similar song. I think it's I don't know whether it's Fela Kuti or Femi Kuti. One is father, one is son.
Yes.
And it's saying, Africa will be great again. Don't be tired, be inspired. Africa will be great. I won't lie. That's all.
Like a live band up.
I know.
Africa will be great again, where peace and love will reign. Africa will be great again. Africa will be great again.
Yeah, but anyway, as we wrap up this episode on Constitutional Amendment Bill, what would be your parting shot to our audience on this bill? Because by the time this episode is going out, public participation may still be open. So what are the key things what is your parting shot?
I think there's something we said again in a previous episode, that often when we engage with the issue or the question of public participation, we tend to engage with it after the fact, after a law has been passed or enacted or policy is already being implemented, is when we ask post fact, was there public participation? And part of the problem is that we wait for invitation when public participation is both a right and a duty. And even what we are doing right now, and I hope we won't be picked by DCI in the current state of things, this is public participation.
It is.
And it's freedom of expression. Before state of emergency. Let's express ourselves freely. And that's my parting shot.
You're assuming as if this bill will pass.
Well, I'm just saying, basically, the gravity of the issues is the things we take for granted.
Yeah.
Let me say this. Often when we look at history, we tend to have this notion that not only did it happen in another time to other people, but it feels so distant, like it was another world.
Yeah.
But this history sometimes we speak of is actually often very recent, very close, touching people even that we know, or people whose blood courses in our veins.
Yeah.
And the things that were happening in those times, in that recent history, some of the dark days, it was still under the reign of human beings. And right now, we are not being governed by angels.
Yeah.
So let's not
Or
assume
AI.
that, certain things are so far removed that they can't happen to us.
Yeah, I think that's a good part in short. Yeah, I think the same thing for me would be not to take it lightly, because there's something that you have made me become alive to in this discussion, is that in all the different ways there has been proposals to change the constitution, whether it's this current 2010 constitution or the previous constitution, I think it is important also to look at the character of the regime, because it really espouses exactly what they want to do. So with the proposals of the constitution, like we see, you gave a brilliant juxtapose in terms of how when Kibaki came in, there seemed to be a participatory mood to change the constitution and to create this social contract among us. And now we have a current regime that seemed to have lost a lot of trust of the people that it's governed. So I feel like my parting shot is, as we move forward in our civic right for public participation, number one, let's not wait for the 25th to pass and the bill passes or goes to the next stage without our views being shared. Like whatever it is, whether it is one part out of all this that you understand or you're about, you don't need to understand the whole bill, but it needs to be we need to be collective and individual, because we can't be collective that we are sitting here saying that, oh, maybe we shouldn't pass this bill, but then no one else is actually writing their views, because there's a way that you can write your views to the Senate.
Submit them,
Yeah, so I feel like as we do that, and not just in this case, as we move forward, we should always investigate and interrogate and be vigilant to everything that our current leaders are doing from their character. We need to assess their DNA. Does this person's DNA have anything that is for me? Do they care for me, for the life of my children, for my livelihood? And from there on now, any sort of proposals, because that is what removes the veil. Because I feel like for so long we've been hoodwinked, and now is when more and more, there's more political consciousness and people are seeing that is different. So my parting shot is, let us not wait. It is our civic duty. It is our right, the same way we have a right to freedom of expression, you have a right to choice of who you want to be associated with. The same way we exercise those rights, I feel like now more than ever we need to exercise the right of public participation and not wait for after the fact. So that even in the period of public participation, if people see the forms of public participation and say, hapana, this is not sufficient, then it will be raised in that time, not waiting for after the time, because now you're leaving that decision to be made by or raised by someone else who may not even be in your interest. So yeah, that's my parting shot on the episode.
Madam Speaker has spoken.
Yeah.
Sina la ziada.
Yeah. So we're calling you guys to go through this document. We'll make sure to link it on our show notes on YouTube and Spotify, where you can get a copy of the Senate bill on the constitutional amendment number 2. And you have until the 25th of October to give your views, whether you support the bill or you don't support the bill. And tell us in the comments some of the key things, some of the shocking things you got to see from the bill, some of the things that maybe you're for and some of them that you're against. Would like to engage, by the way. We actually read your comments. And if you have any sort of topics that you want us to discuss here, or a proposed guest you'd want to sit in here, we will make space. We will make space for them. So please don't forget to subscribe or share this to a friend. We are on all the social media platforms. So we look forward to hearing from you. So stay connected.
See you soon on a screen near you.
Hey, umetushock.